Welcome to the Catholic Culture Podcast. I'm Thomas V. Miras. This podcast is an offering to the Holy Family and, less importantly, a production of CatholicCulture.org. Hey everyone, I'm about to be traveling for much of October, so I won't be able to record anything for the rest of the month. I do have an interview that I've already recorded, which will come out probably next week while I'm away. A very interesting interview with Paul Kengor on the history of the Stigmata. But for now, I figured just to give you something else this month, I'd put out another episode of highlights from episodes far in the past. Today, you're going to hear clips from 3 different past episodes. One of those has to do with the small habits of how we live out our faith in American culture have tended to degrade or become more worldly, and how we can improve some of those things and help to strengthen the church here. Another is from an interview with a great Catholic composer, great musical and spiritual insights. And another is a discussion of one of the very earliest Catholic movies ever made. And as always, I'm linking to the full episodes that these clips came from in the show notes for today's episode, if you want to check those out. So the first couple clips you're going to hear are from episode 82, over 100 episodes ago, A Habitual Counterculture with Brandon McGinley. And this was an interview about, I think, his first book, The Prodigal Church. Let's go back briefly to the stuff about the 1950s. You mentioned some of the reasons that Catholics would have had to be optimistic in the 50s after a long period of hostility from American society towards Catholics, and particularly towards Catholic immigrants in the 19th century. They seem to have finally made it into the American mainstream, especially, as you say, in Hollywood, which was very, in many ways, shaped by Catholicism for a certain period of time. You also mentioned, I think, JFK as sort of like the ultimate kind of failure of that, with success, kind of a failure inherent in the success of that. I think in debates over traditionalism and liturgy and things like that, I think one thing that's often missing is a sense of what things were actually like before the council. Something my dad can sometimes speaks to, because, he was around as a young man before that. But you do get into this in the book. So can you just give a few indications of, problems in the Catholic Church or problems in Catholicism's relation to the mainstream culture prior to the council?
Absolutely, yeah. So, I opened the first chapter of the book with a description of a bulletin that was re-released for the anniversary of a local parish. Bulletins from the 1950s, they were re-releasing. And there were something like 10 or 12 weekend masses. It was tons of apostolates and sodalities and institutions and so on. And in many ways, the portrait of what a thriving parish should look like. But I've also spoken with enough people who were around then to know that at a certain point, when you have masses at 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 1, 2, 3, whatever hours of the day they were, at a certain point, it becomes something of a sacramental factory, which there's nothing wrong with. I mean, there's something charming, of course, about this idea of a kind of sacramental machine that's just churning out sacraments. It's just, churning out engraced people out into the streets. But at the same time, when you have, masses at, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12 o'clock, these are not the kind of very liturgically precise and necessarily, liturgies that you see today in many, Latin Mass communities. This is very much, as was once described to me by a priest of the Diocese of Pittsburgh, get them in, get them out, get them going. This is, like I said, it's almost an industrial production of sacraments, which, like I said, is not intrinsically bad, but at a certain point, the thing becomes rote. At a certain point, it becomes the thing that you do on Sundays because that's what everyone else does on Sundays, and not the thing that you do on Sundays because it is a sacred obligation and a sacred act of love for the Holy Trinity. I think a lot of story my dad tells about how, in his Catholic neighborhood in Pittsburgh in that era, the social event of the season was Christmas midnight mass, when all the boys, the high school boys, would ask girls to go with them, and they would get corsages and get all dressed up and the whole 9 yards. That was the thing everyone did. And again, on the one hand, you're like, how beautiful that the liturgy becomes a social event. It's the church, the parish is truly the center of life. On the other hand, when it gets to the point where Jesus in the Blessed Sacrament is just one more guest at this party, when the liturgical becomes incidental to the social, that's when you have the seeds of a demise that's going to happen the moment it becomes difficult to keep that culture up. And that is what happened. And so Fulton Sheen talked about how the spirit of the bourgeois had infiltrated American Catholicism, how going to Mass had become the thing that respectable people did. And then when what is respectable changes, at the same time that the communities that sustained that way of life in places like the neighborhoods of Pittsburgh were emptying out into the suburbs, and it became much more difficult from a purely logistical point of view to sustain that way of life. And all of a sudden, people's attentions are being pulled in different ways, and you have to make an active decision to get out on Sundays or some other day of the week to attend a parish function. You have to get in the car, and it's a 10, 15, 20, 30-minute drive instead of a 5-minute walk. This begins to demonstrate that the whole thing, and not just because of any sort of confusion or whatever comes out of the Second Vatican Council, but because the whole thing is built on a way of living, broadly speaking, that was passing away. And it turned out that when that way of living passed away, the sacramental, which had been de-emphasized, not necessarily intentionally, but in the way it was lived, sacramental turned out not to be enough to sustain it.
So what happens as the church, the church has been accepted into mainstream culture to a large degree, while still having an outward distinctiveness, even if perhaps it was embracing a worldly spirit, lay people and clergy were embracing a worldly spirit in some respects, there was still, and this is why the traditionalists, some of them, I'm sure it's a caricature of traditionalists to say they want to go back to 1950s, but let's say like the vulgar kind of like the ones who reinforce this stereotype of just wanting to go back to some ideal era. That's one reason they like this previous era in American culture, is because that external distinctiveness was still present. But now then, as the culture moves in a different direction, then, as you say, the church hierarchy and lay people, of course, starts wanting to maintain that comfortable position in American society or in Western society. And, as much as we can talk about, and this is a kind of an issue your book sidesteps, and I think justifiably so, the issue of like kind of actual malice among, say, some of the council fathers, or more of a diabolical agenda. The fact is that none of these things ever really catch on without fear of human respect. I think that's typical of our moment.
Yeah. I talk about the old essay that has formed a lot of my thinking on this stuff. The old essay by Christopher Dawson on Catholicism and the bourgeois mind. And he identifies, and I think rightly so, truly traditional Catholic culture as being anti-bourgeois. It is not interested in accumulation of material goods for worldly ends, is not interested in a kind of an obsession with pragmatism. It is not interested in keeping up appearances. And you see this in a very anti-bourgeois sentiment. In fact, I mentioned in the book, kind of offhand, but I think it's something I really want to explore more at some point, that a certain amount of the anti-Catholicism in American culture, that clash was not so much theological. I think it's in part theological because there's that fear, of course, of obedience to the Pope and that it's anti-American and all that. And I don't think it's necessarily unjustified, but a lot of it is a culture clash between a staid bourgeois Protestantism and an often ecstatic and chaotic and sometimes a little dingy Catholicism. The teeming urban enclaves that Hollywood wanted to make sure we're happy to go see movies, that's why you get the Hays Code, are also seen as culturally threatening to kind of established waspiness. And so if we're talking about any sort of infiltration, I think that the infiltration of the spirit of the bourgeois fits the data better than communists or whatever else the case may be. And like you said, it can also help to explain how certain things took hold in the church that might not have in a previous era. So I think that the data is really fit best by this idea that we became wasps.
You talk about the church losing her distinctiveness in American culture. And, it's easy to point to sort of the changes in the liturgy as a manifestation of that, or the failure of, bishops and priests and lay people to preach distinctively Catholic teachings. But there's also, just on the level of kind of practice and spirit, kind of a flattening, a losing of the savor. And this is something that people have talked about with, the whole like make Catholicism weird again kind of Ross Douthat thing. I think that was him. But you have a great example of this. I'd love you to recapitulate here in the book of this Catholic Social Services Gala that you went to that provides a really great example of this.
Yeah, it's an event I'm familiar with, that was held on a Friday, and all of the important people, not only from the diocese, but from, the local, philanthropic people, they were all there. It's a kind of event where, like, at the end of the week, it appears in the fashion section or the scene section of the Sunday paper in your city. It's like, oh, so-and-so was seen wearing so-and-so, and so-and-so was seen with so-and-so, and all that kind of thing. And it's for a Catholic social services organization. On the one hand, oh, how cool, this is like so mainstream that it's like one of the big events of the season. But it's held on a Friday, and, and clergy are there and the bishop's there. And, they're serving filet mignon or whatever, and everyone gets served a big plate of meat in front of them. There's no sign whatsoever that any sort of dispensation from the typical Friday abstinence has been given by the local ordinary. I know that it's officially not a rule in the USCCB, et cetera, et cetera. But galas are not penitential. The whole idea of removing Friday abstinence was that, oh, well, everyone will be able to figure out some other way that suits them to make Friday into a penitential day. But then when big Catholic organizations are throwing big parties on Fridays, it just kind of puts the lie to that. It makes it look like, and maybe because we don't actually care, that all these little things that built up Catholic culture, these little things that not only build up a kind of cultural distinctiveness, but build up a spiritual distinctiveness. For me, one of the best spiritual practices I took on was making Fridays more and more penitential within reason in my state in life, and then adding a little bit of a celebratory aspect to Sunday, so that every week has a little bit of an arc to it. Every week terminates in a little triduum. That's what it's supposed to be. And then when our big public organizations, with the apparent, more than toleration, with the apparent acceptance and so on of the local ordinary and so on, are throwing big parties on Fridays with filet mignon and so on, you could serve salmon. I mean, salmon's not even that penitential, but at least it makes it look like we care a little bit about Fridays and about the passion and about the idea of that's just baked into Catholicism. It goes back to that corporeality that we've talked about, that embodiedness, that these actions matter, that we live out the reality of Christ's passion in some little ways in the actions we take throughout the year. This to me is basic. And so when you have that, and you have, bland evocations of the work the organization does with no sense whatsoever that it's actually a Catholic organization, except that there are a few Roman collars in the room, it's just disheartening and dispiriting, because, what we have to offer is so much more than this. And, this is not a cranky book. This is not a cranky book that I wrote. It's not an anti-bishops book. It's not an maybe an anti-boomer book, but that's, but it's not a cranky piece of work. And so, tell that story to make the point that, we need to remember that even the little things, like when we schedule our big fancy galas, that we are witnessing in some small way to the reality of the cross. And when we're doing big bashes on Fridays, even not in Lent, it just looks like we don't care. It just looks like we're just like anybody else. And it's like I said, it's dispiriting. And maybe there's some data out there that galas held on Fridays generate 5% more income than any other day. But you know what? Put it on a Saturday, put it on a Thursday, and you know what? Trust that God will make up the difference. That, for me, is just little acts of trust, little acts of faithfulness, little acts of piety that become habits, personally and institutionally, and we get used to them, and that's good. But then when you start to break those habits and you start to get into the habit of doing things as if Fridays don't matter, as if all the little things don't matter, well, that forms habits too. And those are bad habits. And they're habits that can be really hard to imagine what it's like on the other side of. There are a few things that I'll say, if there's one thing you take away from the book, it's this, but this is one of them. Habits matter. And forming little habits in family life and in the life of friendship, in the life of community, those can be those little acts of defiance against secular liberalism and against a kind of indifferentism and against a graceless world where we're doomed to be sinners forever. Those little acts of defiance build up into habits of defiance that become big acts of defiance. That's what virtue is all about. And that applies individually as well as in families and in friendships and in parishes and in dioceses.
Now, my favorite person that I've had on the show a number of times is the Catholic pianist and composer Mark Christopher Brandt. He's just a wonderful person and brings a lot of edifying things to the podcast whenever he comes on. You're about to hear a number of chunks from this episode 68, What I Learned from Making Music with Mark Christopher Brandt. And this was kind of a special one because I had the opportunity to play the piano parts on his album and classical suite, The Butterfly. It's a suite for piano and string quartet. So the context for this first clip is we're talking about the experience that I had working with him in the studio and what I got to learn from that beautiful experience playing that beautiful music. As you'll hear, Mark seamlessly blends the musical and the spiritual. He doesn't compartmentalize those things. And actually, before I play you the clips from the interview, I'm going to play a short section of the suite, The Butterfly. This is the fourth movement, Surrender. And for context, the suite is kind of a spiritual allegory using the symbol of the butterfly. So here is movement 4, Surrender. You impressed on me that, you don't have to be ashamed. It's not a sin, so to speak, to make a mistake. You want to prepare so that you're not wasting studio time and that you can deliver artistically. But the occasional mistake is almost inevitable. And once you're in it, if you've prepared properly, you don't have to apologize for having made a mistake. You can do another take and be cool about it. And there's a freedom in that, in both the intensive preparation and the being chill if a mistake happens in the studio. So that's something that I'm really thankful that you told me that, because I think you saw me getting a little stressed out and upset with myself after having made a couple of mistakes in the recording process. And you said, came over to me and said quietly and, very gently, like, don't apologize, it's fine. So that was something that really stuck with me.
Yeah. Well, when you practice things as many years as these musicians do, these string players that are played with me, and also myself, I've spent years practicing every day. There's few days in my life I haven't practiced at something and trying to master something. And when you spend that much time at something, you inevitably are making mistakes in the process of what you're going for, and then in the delivery of what you've tried to accomplish. So it's inevitable, 365 days a year, if you practice every day for 4 or 5 hours, even 8 hours, if in fact that's how much you practice, the odds of making a mistake in any one of those days or weeks is just astronomical. Mm-hmm. It's off the charts, and it's more than possibly playing everything perfect every single day for a week in a row. So that would be a good analogy number-wise. And that's the point, is that when you do it that much, you learn to realize that the mistakes are not something that you get hung up over. They're just naturally, they'll happen, and you move away from them quickly, or they become a stigma that doesn't have to be there. And you start obsessing over the fact that you made a mistake. It usually has to do more with lack of preparation and or lack of experience in that realm. In your case, I saw it as lack of experience because you were totally prepared. So there was no need for you to apologize for making a mistake, because you were in that world with all of these musicians that, like you said, it's inevitable, and you just move on. It's the thing I tell all my Catholic students, that I ask them, what's the difference in a mistake and a sin? And they, almost all of them, answer, a sin is something you do intentionally or knowingly that's bad and you shouldn't do it. And you analyze the choice, or you look at the choice, or you fall to the choice, but it's something that you're involved in and you shouldn't do, or you should be sorry after you've done it. But a mistake is something that can happen to anyone. It's completely arbitrary, involuntary. It's no one, in other words, nobody makes a mistake on purpose for any reason at all, unless they're actually making a mistake on purpose to mess somebody up and act like it's a mistake, in which case that's a sin.
Right.
So that clarity is the freedom, that mistakes are just absolutely nothing to be afraid of or worry about. And if more children were taught that, then the world would be a different place. There's a black and white teaching there that's very easy to confirm and live with on a daily basis with small children, and it becomes the way of life when you're older. You just don't need to be hung up about the mistakes. If you drop something and make a mess, you clean it up. You don't walk away. So even there, it's not essential that you apologize, as that you get engaged and clean up the mess you made so as not to inconvenience someone.
Right. You take responsibility.
Yeah, of course. And it's easier to take responsibility for either when you have a clear teaching at a young age of both. So anyway, that's really why I approached you, was to bring you up to the level where you already were musically, but everybody else is living in. Mistakes happen, and okay, I'd like to go and do that again. I can play that better. That's what I've always heard from all the musicians I've worked with, and that's what I say. Hey, I got to do that again. I need to do that again. There's a mistake. Hey, I didn't hear a mistake. Oh, it's right here. Everybody's happy to point them out. I'm happy to point mine out so we can get the best out of ourselves and give the best to the listener.
Right, right. Well, it's a precious lesson, and also, having this not just as an experience in my life, but as a recording, as a document, that's a precious thing to be able to go back to, because I can see the results. It's really clear and objective, and I have that as kind of a touchstone to go forward. So that's one of the reasons that I'm grateful for the experience, not just because of that specific music, of course, which is wonderful and a great thing to work on, but also just the experience of going through the process and seeing the results.
Yeah. Yeah. It's sad because that really is one of the things that the pop culture and the modern culture is losing, because everybody can do these things at home with their own basic toys, not to demean the technology, but the fact that all of this electronics is so available and you can push a couple of buttons, get a couple of sounds, a couple of things happening, then you sing a little thing here, a little thing there, throw harmony on it, and then you can put it up on YouTube or Facebook and Instagram, whatever, and everybody likes it and loves it and says you're amazing. And you never really understand the process of what a real artist goes through, like you just described. And having something documented is an incredible part of being an artist. It's not simply, hey, look at me, I did an album. It's documentation of you as a person in the time continuum of artists. And it's absolutely essential, if you're a real artist, to have some form of documentation. And same as if you were a sculptor, you would want to have something sculpted that you did that you could point to and say, here's the proof that I'm a sculptor. There it is. This is my work. So that's the unfortunate reality of what we're dealing with young people. They don't even, unfortunately, see a need for piano lessons often, because they can do so much of what I'm trying to share with them now on their own with a couple of buttons and a tiny keyboard. They don't even need the 88 keys. So they don't need that process you described. So you're right. It's an incredible, gift to have it documented. And that is the goal of the artist, is to have documentation and then a reference as to what's next.
Right.
Where's my legacy and where am I going?
And this goes back to actually something you were talking about in our previous interview, because you were talking about how when you were recording your totally improvised solo piano albums, the way that it changed you is you would look back the next day after recording it or after it was released and say, well, if I can do that, then I need to be doing so much more. And you were talking in a spiritual context there, but of course, also in a musical context. And it's very interesting how something that we've already accomplished, or God has accomplished through us, we've already done it, and yet it can serve as a challenge for the future.
Yeah, yeah. Well, that was pretty much a definitive statement there. don't need to expound on that. That's exactly what it's about. And that's again why you document it, because it also helps you stop the process and move to the next place. If all you do is ever practice and work, and you don't have objectivity, you can love what you're doing and everything's great. But if you don't have some kind of reference that you've accomplished goals in your life, then you don't really know when you're ready to go to the next level, or if you even need to. But when you document something you actually were attempting, and you can objectively listen to it, then is your next project going to be in this realm of difficulty, or are you going to move to a new level of challenge? And is the challenge physical, or is it more sound-based, like more harmony-based, more melodic, more improvisational? All of those things, come from the process of practicing. And it's why a lot of people do recitals when they're kids, so they can move to the next, the next place. They used to say that you're only as good as your last performance. So whatever your last performance was, that's how good you are. And now you need to go forward from there, and so there's some truth to that. But it's just like, prayer or living the Christian life. If all you do is ever pray, you pray your prayers and you are with your family, but you never encounter other humans, you never go out and drive in traffic, then you're never going to get challenged. So you don't know if you're growing closer to Christ or just getting better at following the rules.
Yeah.
Once you have an encounter with a person and they challenge your beliefs or they challenge your behavior, then you suddenly realize, okay, am I leaning on Jesus in this moment, or am I leaning on Mark in this moment? And then okay, I can pray more, but it's really more about the surrender in the moment to Christ. And more prayers may not be the answer, but more actual application of what you're asking for in prayer is what's needed.
Right.
With the value of the rosary is, of course, where I'm looking at always, because in the end, you're not asking for things for yourself necessarily. You're asking for virtues for yourself. You're trying to become virtuous, not acquire houses and cars and property. That's the idea. Or you're trying to be charitable and kind to people. That's why we pray. We don't pray for, the reason of prayer is not for cars and money and all of that. That's something you can ask for, and it helps you grow in trust. But the point of prayer is communion with God and to know Him better and grow with Him. And the more you do that, the more you realize that He's going to give you the house and the money and the cars and all the things you really want, just because you're actually following Him and trying to be with Him.
Right.
So, kind of got off on a tangent there, but I felt like I finished it.
That's great. I mean, it's kind of like, I guess it's basically like why, if you're not living the graces given to you in prayer, then what good is adding, another hour of prayer
Yes, right.
to your day going to do?
Right. Yeah, and it's the same thing with practice. If you practice all the time and practice, and you're getting good and you're really getting good, but you never go into the studio and know the pressure of having to do it right and having to fix your mistakes and face them, having to interact with other people who might make a mistake while you were playing perfect, and now you have to go and do it again because they failed, and that teaches you patience and love for their humanity. These are all spiritual lessons that are acquired by being in the mix with musicians at this higher level.
Yeah.
And so then you realize when you're impatient with somebody because they made a mistake, you don't need to go practice the piano more. You need to be more gentle and respectful of other people's process as you would like them to be with you. So that becomes spirituality, not musicality.
Now I'm going to play another clip from the Brandon McGinley interview where he talks about the danger of spiritual corrosion from indulging in immoderate anger towards the hierarchy of the church. Let's talk about the bishops, specifically about the present feeling that the faithful laity have towards the church hierarchy, especially at the episcopal level. There's the Fulton Sheen quote, which I'm sure you know about, how it's our job as lay people to make sure that the priests act like priests and the bishops act like bishops. I feel like that's easy to misunderstand, and I'm not sure that I totally understand exactly what it should look like in practice. But what does that mean to you?
Yeah, I think it's certainly not something I would take in the sense that, we're supposed to become like lobbyists. Like back when I was in a previous life, I worked for a pro-life, pro-family public policy organization, and we were encouraging people. The idea was to encourage every social conservative Christian in Pennsylvania to become basically a lobbyist who is emailing and calling their representatives and so on. That's not the relationship we have to our priests and bishops. We don't have a relationship to our priests and bishops like we do to our elected representatives. That's a completely different kind of relationship. The other thing I would say is that, very distinctively remember a homily was given by one of our priests at my parish, and it was just, I took it to be, frankly, a really hopeful thing, although not so hopeful for bishops, that the lay people are not going to be judged by the administration of the church. Bishops will be judged by the administration of the church. And so that doesn't mean that we just become passive, but it does mean that we don't get ourselves worked up over things that are not, at the end of the day, our ecclesial or frankly even moral responsibility. Now, this gets into difficult territory when you're talking about things like actual criminal acts, both canonical and civil, when we're talking about the abuse crisis and things like that. The abuse crisis doesn't just happen because a bunch of clerics get together and say they're going to cover things up. A bunch of lay people said, yes, we're going to help you. So it's not like that you turn a blind eye to actual crimes, like I said, canonical or civil. But I think that, it is incumbent on lay people to, most important parts about being a lay person in the Catholic Church. Certainly, I'm a father of four, and, as a leader in a family, is to organize your life in the life of those whose lives you have any sort of authority over around getting to heaven, around pursuing the life of virtue, the life of holiness, as well as possible. And just doing that, I think, has an impact on the way dioceses and parishes are run. And there are times where the best thing you can do is to stick with a parish that's struggling. But there are times also where the best thing you can do is to say, I'm going to go somewhere that is going to be better spiritually for me and my family. And so sometimes it's just as simple as that. Not taking a consumeristic approach, but taking a holistic, integrated approach to the spiritual life. Simply things like that, just saying that, like, I'm going to prioritize my salvation. And bishops and priests, seeing that, will act differently. When the median layperson is not acting in that way, when the median layperson is acting in terms of, maximizing respect or maximizing respectability or maximizing their pocketbook or whatever, then for better or for worse, there's going to be a response to that. And so simply all of us pursuing holiness in our own states in life, that for me is I guess, priority number one when it comes to ensuring that the hierarchy performs its tasks. And I know, like, the church has a long and glorious history of laity not liking their priests and their bishops and everyone in between. I don't mean that we all have to become, like, pathetically, parroting the PR lines that are coming down from the chancery. No, I don't mean that at all. But I also think that the injunction that we should have, the idea that we should take any sort of special responsibility for the work of priests and bishops, begins with us taking responsibility for ourselves and letting the example of what the faithful are doing inform what priests and bishops are doing rather than haranguing them.
So, yeah, we don't want to be naive, but it seems like complaining constantly on social media about the bishop is really not going to solve anything.
It doesn't move the ball. It doesn't move the ball at all. And I'm really tired of it, because not only do I think that it is corrosive to piety in the sense of the individual, I think that it is corrosive to piety in the sense of everybody who's reading it, because I've just seen too much anger. And I know the irascible appetite is a real and good thing. We're supposed to become upset over injustice, social injustice, and ecclesial spiritual injustice. Foremost form of which is irreligion. There's often a lack of piety and a lack of virtue and a lack of a lot of things in the institutional church. But I think that we can be tempted. Don't get me wrong, the abuse crisis is a world historical example of this. But I think the idea that we are led by a bunch of knaves and fools and cowards right now at this particular moment is, there's almost a certain pridefulness in it, as if this moment is so much worse than every other moment in church history. But the church has always been led by knaves. That's the Belloc line, about any worldly institution that was, ordered with such knavish imbecility would have collapsed within a fortnight, and just constantly becoming upset about it. I really have trouble understanding. I know some people have a fuller expression of the irascible appetite in their personalities than I do, but it's really hard for me to see how that moves the ball personally or ecclesially. What bishops see that moves them, what a bishop who's really doing the work, who really wants to do right by his people, and more often than not they are, even as there are lots of counterexamples, what is going to move them is seeing the faithful do things that inspire them to create the conditions in their dioceses to make more of that possible. I know we often feel like we're fighting an uphill battle, and there is the reality of politicking and getting involved in councils and, I was on a committee, I've been on several committees and things like that. But, I really don't think kind of a constant anger that acts like, we're somehow uniquely poorly led. I don't think it helps.
Okay, so another clip from the interview with Mark Christopher Brandt. In this, I asked him about how he understands being part of a continuum, the timeline of great artists in history, and finding your place in that, and being the artist and indeed the person that God made you to be. Can you talk a little bit about your idea of the continuum? This is a word that I've heard you use a lot, and it's something like the tradition. Is it synonymous with the tradition, or is there a slightly different emphasis there?
Yeah, I don't know about the tradition aspect of it. I know that's in it. But when I was at Berkeley in Boston studying, that's the word my teacher used. And he was discussing that you learn and you are in a continuum. In other words, he used Charlie Parker. And I was fascinated by the fact that Charlie Parker passed away, and then John Coltrane, appeared on the scene, or basically took the mantle and continued the saxophone from there. Charlie Parker was playing alto. He started playing tenor at the end of his life. And a lot of people don't know that. And then John Coltrane comes along and starts out being a tenor player and kind of became the next real person to listen to and study with, and took, some of these things to the next level as far as musicianship. And so that was the word that my teacher used to describe it. It's a continuum. And he was saying, you're part of the continuum. And so you're not going to have a great career trying to do what was done in the 40s. You're going to need that to understand what came before you, but you're going to do better being in the continuum if you be who you are at your time and process everything and then deliver it with your view. And that's the next part of the timeline. And it was beautiful because it doesn't require you to be famous. In a very real way, it requires you to be genuine and honest in your study, in your development, and then in your integrity. Your offering has to be completely you and completely based on your experiences and your view of all things. And that was very helpful to me because it formed me to work hard at me. And that's, of course, a precursor to being a Catholic and a Christian, following Jesus specifically, because it's not just a religious thing, it's a spiritual way. And you cannot deny yourself if you don't know who you are. So it goes the same with music. If you don't really know who you want to be, you can't offer music that you can live with and sleep with and die over and say, yep, I like it. And if you don't like it, it's okay, but I like it, and that's why I've produced it. You have to be able to have that kind of commitment to the music and to the continuum and to yourself. So I don't know if I answered your question well, but
no, that's good.
Trying to think it through as it comes, because you're just part of the time loop. And I guess that's the point really I meant to finish with, was it isn't about being famous. It's about being great at what you do and never giving up that attempt or that daily attempt at being greater and doing something better than you did yesterday, and always trying to offer it for the simple fact that you can. That's it, because God made you to do this, so that's why you do it. There's no other reason to do it. And there are, how many souls in heaven, they're all hearing it, and we're all going to be with them one day. And they all have to be factored in as listeners.
Wow.
Because, one day I could meet the Lord in my judgment with my accounting, and he's going to ask me like the wicked servant, so why didn't you do anything? And well, because nobody wanted to hear it, and nobody was buying it, and nobody was appreciating it. Everybody said I was on the wrong path. I was afraid I'd look stupid. There's a million things you can say, but then he's going to say, well, what about all these thousands of people who were dying to hear what God could do through you? And see, I'm not going to have to hear that, because I'm taking this challenge to heart of being who I'm supposed to be. And it isn't just here while I'm here on this planet for a few people or 1,000 people or how many people are buying my albums. It's for all those people who are listening to my music constantly in heaven, even as it's in me and not recorded, because they hear it before it's out of my soul, because it's coming from the magnificent artist centered in heaven.
Wow, that's incredible.
It frees you, and it's daunting in the beginning when you first convert if you go there, but that's my freedom, is to know that.
Yeah.
So that's really what continuum means for me, is that it's, and there's just hundreds of examples of that validation with great musicians, and they're not great in their lifetime, they're great later. And I hope for only to be as great as I can be while I'm here. What happens after I'm gone is completely irrelevant to me. I'm moving to the next place.
But moving to the practical, and can you talk a little bit about, the process of actually, specifically as a composer, becoming a part of that continuum? We have these early pieces on the album that are perhaps the beginning or close to the beginning of your process of grafting yourself onto that tree. In a general way, what kind of study goes into that? Especially for someone,
the,
especially perhaps for someone who's beginning
mm,
as a composer.
mm. Yeah, well, first of all, you have to be open to everything. You have to be open to lots of music. You can't make a decision about what's good or bad because, and again, this is where I get in trouble because people decide they know what I'm thinking at that. But so I'll have to be a little bit clear to try to avoid some of that. But music with suggestive lyrics or bad lyrics, foul language, things that take you down into a darker thought process, there's no reason for that. I understand, I get it. I have come from the world without Christ and have joined him and converted and found the wisdom in his way. So I want to be clear, I'm not speaking from a throne or a holier than thou place, but the fact is, it's just not uplifting to listen to music like that with lyrics that send you, into bad thoughts or dark thoughts or angry thoughts or sexual thoughts. It's pointless and silly. But there are lots of great pop songs, great songs from the pop world that are very clever. They're ironic in their writing. They have poetry involved. The way they craft these phrases together and tell a story in a 3-minute song sometimes is really amazing. And so you have to sort through to find them, maybe, but it's worth that to understand what's involved in this gift of music, because that's also what's involved in composing praise music, is to be able to do it well and not just rehash, the folk music from a certain period or the rock music of a certain period. In order to really have music that moves people, it can't always just be about, emotion or simple things that for a fact will sell in the genre you're in. My point is, if you're going to be a composer, then you also should know a little bit at least about songwriting. You have to know a little bit about improvisation. And the more you know about that in each of those things, the better off you'll be as a composer. And I think that it's just being open to everything and remembering that what we've lost, because that's where you learn this. For me, I think I've mentioned to you before that when I study composers, I'm not just studying their music, but I read about their lives. I want to know who they were and why they did what they did. And you learn, like Bach was everything. Bach said, there's no reason to write anything except for the glory of God. So that's why he wrote everything. But he wrote for his students, he wrote for shows, concerts, for kings, for whoever he got hired for. But he also wrote songs for his family. And they would get together and have parties and dinners and drinks and in social and improvise and make up things and sing songs and all of this stuff that was whatever of the culture of their day. Not all of it was for serious concerts, serious things, sacred music, or his students. Some of it was just flat out fun and recreation and enjoyment. And that's my point. You have to know all of the things that people are moved by, because if you only know one way of writing, then you are selling yourself short and you're cheating the listeners, because you have to challenge the listener with something that they haven't heard before and something that brings in things. It isn't that you're reinventing the wheel. It's that they literally haven't heard the sounds that I'm putting together, because no one's ever done them before. Nobody's strung the music together the way I am, because I'm a unique individual who's following my unique path. But that path has been built by my studying everybody who came before me and being open to everything that's come before me, including, birds chirping in the woods and water running and all the rhythmic aspects that you come there, which Beethoven was influenced by, and putting together music from that experience. So then I write my music and somebody hears it, and there's one person says, this is really beautiful, and another says, oh yeah, but it's not like the pop music, or it's not real jazz, or it's not classical. So there you have a person who's, needing that music that fills their small little world view. And we're always going to have people like that, but the artist can never be ruled by that reality. They have to be an individual. So that's, if you're going to be a composer, basically you have to have a thick skin. I guess that's the answer. Listen to everything, be influenced by everything. Don't decide that something's not good. Don't decide that some music is not relevant until you actually have studied it. And then you can make the statement, okay, this music does not serve a purpose in my path, but it might have a purpose in someone else's. So be careful about saying whether it's worthless or not. That's always a very dangerous place to go with your public comments.
Yeah, it's not the answer I expected, but it's such a basic necessity for study, because otherwise, like you said, you're selling yourself short.
Yeah.
You know, it's not so much that you have a moral obligation to know this or that composer, but as an artist, you need it. You need to be open and learn what's come before. It's not so that you can impress someone with your knowledge of the classics or something.
Right. That's well said. I agree. You study because you want to know and you want to learn and you want to be good at what you do. And, that's why, I'm not the only person saying this, but there are many people, younger than myself, not only my own family, my daughters who are much younger, of course, and then their peers. There's so many of them just disgusted with what's out there musically. And it isn't because it's all foul language or bad or whatever, or suggestive. It's just not well written. And there's so many people who don't even know, who some of the great pop songwriters were before them, or have no use for that. So even in that limited sphere, they're not studying people who came before them. They're just jumping in and saying, I want to write a song because I can string chords together, so I'm going to be an artist. And that's the world we live in, and that's a very big problem now, is that everybody is equal to Beethoven now. Everybody is equal to Gershwin now. Nobody has to pay dues and practice and work. I think I'd better qualify my statement, because I just realized I think you can't discount pop music that occurs up until about 1982. and I was thinking that, actually, when I was thinking of pop music, that after 82, maybe 83, we could push it to 86 for a couple of tunes probably. And, maybe something's happened since there's nothing going on now because they don't have the cultural memory. They're not interested in studying that. And they should be studying those who came before them.
Now to introduce the third episode you'll be hearing from in this highlights episode. This was actually not from the Catholic Culture Podcast, but from Criteria, the Catholic Film Podcast. Early on, we discussed what is considered to be the very first feature-length narrative film ever made. And we discussed this because it was on the Vatican film list, which we were going through on that podcast. It's a French silent film, Vie et Passion du Christ, the Life and Passion of Christ. Very interesting. And so here I talk a bit about the unique features of these early silent films, and my co-host James Majewski and I talk about some interesting aspects of this very early film based on the gospel, which came out in 1903. Basically, in its final form, this is one of the earliest feature-length narrative films. Most films at this time were, the very earliest films were like 10 seconds, 30 seconds, a minute long. And most films by this time, 7 or 8 years into the history of cinema, were one reel or less. So they'd be like 10 or 15 minutes long. So this was pushing the boundaries of film length at the time. There was another film, I think, maybe the same year, also about Jesus, and it was not quite as long as this, I think, but it may be a comparable length. What's interesting is some film historians dispute whether these should be counted as feature films, because like a lot of films, especially longer films back then, they were released in multiple parts of one scene each, and the exhibitor at the time was left with a lot of freedom as to whether to show all the scenes together or how many scenes to show. So exhibitors in general played a much greater part in like the final product than they would today. If only for the reason that the soundtrack of the film was very often provided in theater. And in the early days, especially when film was like this totally new thing, and a lot of film clips would just be what they called actualities. I don't know if you'd call them documentary, just like a thing happening, and just the fact that it was on film was itself interesting to people. Right. And just like somebody, like workers leaving a factory at the end of the day, and it's like a 10-second clip. So you'd often have a person in there in the theater who was like explaining what you're about to see and commenting on things. I think I even read somewhere that they would have occasionally voice actors behind the screen saying things, but music especially was very commonly provided by musicians in-house. If it was like a smaller theater, it could be like a small organ or something. Sometimes you'd have a small orchestra, and this kind of developed as time went on, but it was a huge source of gigs for American musicians at one point. Like it was a large percentage of working musicians in our country were working as musicians for silent films. What's interesting about this as a religious film too, with the exhibitor having so much control, is that depending on the audience, if you had an audience of Baptists versus Catholics, I read that there was like one scene, I don't know which one it was, that wouldn't have been pleasing to a Baptist audience, so they removed it. Anyway, it just goes to show you that we're dealing with a whole different era of film, and one which, basically any silent film, especially from this early on, we're very like fortunate to have, because I think like 80% of silent films that were ever made are lost. They were not considered things that would be watched decades later, and just based on the way that they were exhibited and what was required to do it and the technology used, people didn't see the reason to save these things. Pans were very unusual at this time. You almost never had moving cameras. And the pans in this do feel kind of like very slow and laborious. It's just interesting how the technology shapes so much of the artistic quality of these pieces in terms of their influence from theater and the visual arts, with just like a closed frame. The first moving cameras were just cameras that were placed on boats. So I think the very first time was they put it on a gondola in Venice and like shot some of Venice from a gondola. And then they did the same thing with like a boat on the Nile. Because however the cameras were constructed, they weren't easy to turn or move. Close-ups are also very rare in silent film. There's 2 close-ups in this film, both at very significant moments in the Passion. The Ecce Homo moment and the Veil of Veronica. There's a close-up of that. In this film, you do have some nice, aside from the few pans, you do have some nice matching where somebody will leave on one side of the frame and then it'll cut to a new set and they'll enter from the correct side. So there's a sort of continuity there.
Yeah, I think the flight into Egypt sequence is the most complicated in its editing, because it takes them from, well, that's actually an amazing sequence. It begins with the angels adoring the infant Christ in the home, and then they disappear, and then it's an empty room. So that's like, first off, a really cool way to begin that sequence, because you're kind of, the veil is pulled back and you see the sort of spiritual reality before Joseph enters to a seemingly empty room and he goes to sleep, and then there's the whole angel warning him in a dream. But then that sequence takes us all the way to Egypt, to the very foot of the Sphinx. So there's a lot that happens in between, as opposed to some of the other sequences that are just a single scene or a single pan. This has a lot of intricate cuts where we see the Holy Family leave their home, and then it cuts outside to them outside of the home. But then we also see the soldiers pursuing them. There's like a battle sequence with an angel defending them. It's a really impressive sequence.
Yeah, so I mean, we can see in this film the early development of some of these techniques of continuity before editing became easier, before moving cameras became easier, and the filmmakers are slowly, over this first decade or decade and a half, are figuring out, okay, what can we do to break through the limitations of this one frame? it is still very, visual, very much like a painting or something in some respects, very much like a stage for a play in some respects, but you can see the artifice that takes it to a more unique place as an art form.
I think that seeing the limitations that are being challenged or overcome is part of the delight, especially in the special effects.
Yeah.
There's a particular kind of delight in seeing, wow, how they were able to pull that one off.
Right.
That's kind of lost nowadays when special effects are so masked over. For whatever reason, I'm thinking about how in recent years we've seen films try to resurrect dead actors, via CGI. I'm specifically thinking about Star Wars.
Yeah, Rogue One.
Yeah. And how that seems to be like, to me, that seems to suggest a misplaced notion of realism that isn't operating in these early films, where there is no kind of pretense. Nobody thinks for a moment that the artifice isn't visible anymore. So there's kind of like an embracing of the sense of the artificial.
Right.
And in embracing that, I think the result is something that's somehow more satisfying, more spectacular. These close-ups, for instance, there's something really striking about, especially the Behold the Man, the Ecce Homo close-up. There's something so striking about it because it's so, on one level we could say, well, that's not very realistic. What happened to all of his surroundings? What happened to all the people around him? Because in the close-up, all we see is Jesus and the words Ecce Homo behind him on, a blank canvas. But in another sense, there's something that's so much more, well, if not realistic, more eloquent.
And I think the embrace of artifice is part of what contributes to like the childlike quality of this film. And I think also because of the acting style and a number of other things about it, you have to kind of embrace a childlike spirit to enter into it. There's a nice article by Stephen Bredanis, the Catholic film critic, about this film, and he's using it as an example of how it's good to watch silent films with young children, and they have a greater capacity to appreciate it when they're that age than adults who sort of like aren't used to it, and also that you can explain, because there's no talking, you can explain things to the children and have like a commentary going, which is in fact how some silent films are originally shown to the children. So it's a very, I would recommend, we'll link to that article in the show notes. And also, if I didn't already mention, this is on YouTube, this film, so I'll link to that as well for people to watch it. But it wouldn't be a bad idea to watch that with your kids. And why not give them the capacity to appreciate that when you can, and then they will be able to appreciate it later. Okay, one final clip, and this is again from the Mark Christopher Brandt interview. And in this, he talks about the gradual process of conversion and the way in which we mistakenly sometimes assume that people who have certain virtues that we don't have, we assume that it came easily to them or that they were just sort of born that way. And so we sort of shut ourselves out from the possibility of becoming like that ourselves. And so a very beautiful spiritual point that he makes here. So this will be the last clip of the episode, and I hope you enjoyed it. And there will be another new interview again with Paul Kengor on the history of the stigmata very soon. I would like to go back to the spiritual sort of allegory of the butterfly, and specifically what you said at the end of the liner notes, which the listeners will have heard me read earlier, where you talk about after the butterfly has achieved his transformation and how people look at him and see a beautiful butterfly and don't remember what he used to be. And you said, I'll read it again, that becomes irrelevant to us. And so we are no longer inspired to face our own cocoons. Instead, we look upon those who are no longer bound by theirs as the chosen few. This is something that, you talked about a lot in our last interview too. In that one, we talked about making the process transparent to people so that they won't be intimidated by it. But this is on a spiritual level, well, I guess I just would like to raise that so you can talk a little bit more about that concept at the end there.
Well, it's funny. I guess the way to get into that, in the homily I heard today at Mass, the priest said, in his opinion, his view, he said there are two kinds of Catholics. There are those who would tell Jesus, stop suffering so much and come down from the cross. I need a breather, and you shouldn't have to work that hard. You're God. And then there are the others who would say, thank you for what you're doing, and I want to come up and join you on that cross. And he was making a very clear distinction between what happened with Peter in the reading where he said, Lord, you shouldn't go to Calvary, you shouldn't be crucified. And the Lord said, get behind me. You're thinking, Satan, you're thinking as humans do, not as God does. And so he was making that point that there are those who would like everything to be a little bit easier, and there are those who want. And he said, you have to think, pray, and decide which category you're in. He didn't say anything about who's better or not. He just made the distinction. And I agree with him. I actually have seen that as my own experience. And so that is kind of the basis of the Butterfly in that writing, because when I first converted, I was very young, and I realized I was a lot younger than I am now, I should say. I wasn't necessarily very young. I was in my 30s. But I noticed that, everybody looked at me like I was some young guy who came in with a family and a young child, and I'm this person who's had no suffering, no struggles. I don't really know about the real world. I'm friendly, happy. I'm always smiling. I never seem to be upset. And, as time went on, 5 years in of pushing 40, I'm still getting that from everybody. And people are talking to me like I'm, you haven't lived long enough to really know what's going on. And, when you have some suffering, you start to understand more about life. By then, I had had quite a lot of suffering and a lot of different unique challenges, which I don't need to go in here. But I chose to do all of this with the practice of Catholicism, which is a practice of, self-denial and not complaining, and making the act of the will to choose to follow the Lord in good and bad. And that means, you accept everything by his grace and with his grace. And the observation was, I noticed that those who are truly walking the walk and really trying to be with Jesus end up being seen by many as people who are naive, not really well-rounded, not a lot of true wisdom, that don't have common sense, they don't get it, they're stupid even. I mean, you can put a lot of labels there, but those people who are following, in a nutshell, they're Christians at this level of joy. They clearly don't have a clue, because if they really knew what suffering was, they really knew how hard it was out here for us normal people, then, they wouldn't be like they are, and they wouldn't be so joyful, and they wouldn't be so quick to tell us that we should pray or we should maybe consider following Jesus, the way they are. In other words, you become a hypocrite by their label, even if you're actually working to not be a hypocrite. And that was my observation, was that the more I worked, the more I became peaceful and more in love with God, and the less I let my problems bother me, the more kind I was all the time, the more people looked at me like I was, basically an idiot and didn't understand anything about the world at all. And I haven't spent the time defending that, because it was an observation, but I was the last one to know. So even in my own view, I had factored that in with that writing, because I remember distinctly, and I have to be honest, before my conversion, I was a person with a very short temper, a very bad temper, and I think we can just leave it at that, but you can imagine what goes with that. And a very angry, permanently angry person. And
Wow.
I think that's the way I can describe it. And patience, are you kidding? None, zero. And I remember after being, in church and being converted and actually following. I always like to say I'm following Jesus, not just going to church, because there is a difference. But after following the Lord and really studying for a little while and trying to learn how he is and who he is, I had this confrontation with somebody. Actually, I had a conversation and not a confrontation, but this woman looked at me and I said, yeah, well, I'm going to have to probably work a little on this, getting this point across over here or there. And she was like, oh, you're going to be fine. You're like the most peaceful person I've ever met in my life. It's just so relaxing to be around you. And this was an agnostic person, not a spiritual person. She said, it's so calming to be next to you. And you handle everything so peacefully and you have such patience. And I'm pretty sure she noticed that my jaw was open, because she was saying something to me that I did not recognize had yet occurred. And I went and sat down and thought about it, and I realized, oh my gosh, I'm not who I used to be. This is really beautiful. And this is what comes from that, work with Jesus. He definitely will change us if we're interested in changing, but sometimes we're the last one to know that we've changed. And if we don't have that documentation, like an album, well, this woman was a documentation of that. Then I was able to strive more for even greater patience, because she was saying I was that, and I was thinking that I wasn't that. And so I had to bow to her view, because she had no reason to, say something to me other than what was true in that particular situation. She didn't gain anything by saying that. It was just something off the cuff remark. And I realized then that I wasn't paying attention to what grace was doing in my life as well as I should. And I started to realize that maybe all of those people I had judged as clueless or stupid, they might not have been. They may have been higher up than I even realized, and they had the humility to just let people say that about them. And as that has been my experience, not to say I'm humble, because you know what happens when you say that, but still, we are supposed to be working on this, and we are, just like I always tell people trying to become holy, I'm trying to become a great pianist. If at some point I start doing great things on the instrument, I ought to be able to admit it. That's not bragging, that is humility. Saying the truth, not just the truth of that I need more practice, because that is true, but there's also a truth that I have achieved a degree of mastery. And that would translate to I have become one with Christ in many areas of my life. It is him living and not me, as St. Paul says. And we all can have that. But unfortunately, we're all looking at these people who have that and are going around peacefully and prayerfully. And we're saying, well, if they had the problems I have, then they would know what's really going on and they wouldn't float around like that. And so I guess I've taken a long time answering that, but it was in Portugal recently where I was sitting with some people and they were talking and asking questions, and some of them had discovered my past and found out what I was like before I converted. And it was eye-opening, because everyone was thinking, gosh, I just thought you had grown up, had great family experience, great education, great this, great that. Everything was smooth for you. You're a cradle Catholic. You've just never had any problems, and it's just like clockwork for you, and everything's lined up perfectly. I just thought, and you're always at Mass praying. I just figured you're just the textbook case of somebody who never gets scathed by anything. And then we all laughed, because that is exactly the opposite of my story.
Yeah.
And you know that. No. So that's why I wrote that particular thing, and that was the catalyst of the music itself, was early on just writing music that matched my personal conversion and trying to be objective about who I had become and who I was. And that answers your first question, why did I not play on the album? Because I wanted to be watching me as the butterfly and see the whole thing happening and try to be objective about where I need to go next to keep flying.